Hello, this is the Nameless Scholar, and let me tell you a story of another Word-Bearer's Legion in somewhere else. The Word-Bearers are tireless in their crusade to have the galaxy worship the Emperor as a divine. It is a duty they carry out with both impassioned, fiery rhetoric and the cleansing purity of the bolt gun. They were one of the first legions to comprehend the existence and threat of chaos, and that faith in the God Emperor was sole armor against its wiles. They used this knowledge to save War Master Horus from possession on Davin, but to their eternal regrets, were unable to prevent the Dornian Heresy, which crippled their living deity. As guardians of the faith, they founded the galaxy-spanning ecclesiarchy, and after witnessing how it nearly plunged the Imperium into another civil war, now act as its moral compass to ensure that such a powerful body can never again be corrupted. Uniquely among the Emperor's Primarchs, Lorgar's formative years were spent not on the battlefield, but within the cloistered halls of the seminary, struggling with concepts of faith and the nature of divinity. The planet of Colchis had been settled early in the first wave of human expansion into the galaxy, but had become isolated and fallen into feudalism during the Age of Strife. Through the long millennia, an order known as the Covenant remained a spark of hope against the darkness. Though much of the meaning behind their belief had been lost to superstition, they kept alive the knowledge of a humanity that had colonized distant stars, and the promise that one day they would be reunited. The tale of how Lorgar came to the Covenants is recounted by Pinius in his Speculum Historiale. It points that Lorgar was subconsciously aware that the Emperor was searching for him, and this was the reason the Covenant's tenets resonated so strongly. Once initiated into the Covenant, he observed every aspect of the vast and complex creed, and as would be expected of a Primarch, excelled in its practice, driven by the knowledge that reunification was at hand, and urged on by his friend and mentor, Corpharon. Lorgar undertook a pilgrimage across Colchis, preaching to whoever would listen. His speeches were electrifying, and soon drew the crowds in their tens of thousands, but gave his political enemies a chance to eliminate what they saw as a powerful rival. It was only with an army approaching that Lorgar's innate skills in warfare came to the fore. Over the course of 18 months, his small entourage of clerics and civilians was transformed into a battle-hardened army numbering in the hundreds of thousands that swept away all who opposed them. Lorgar had not started the fight, but he was determined to finish it. Whenever he wearied of the slaughter, Corpharon was there to assure him of the righteousness of their cause, and by the time the final enemy stronghold was razed to the ground and peace restored, the death toll was truly monumental. His actions were vindicated though, when shortly after the Emperor, accompanied by Magnus of the Thousand Suns, did indeed land on Colchis. Unafraid, Lorgar knelt before the Master of Mankind and pledged the planet to his worship. Lorgar was instructed by Magnus on the marvels of the Emperor's Imperium and given command of the Legion of Astartes based upon his genetic pattern. He named them the Word-Bearers and inducted his most devout followers into their ranks. Corpharon was of course amongst the first members of the Covenant chosen to join the Legion, but in a tragic twist of fate suffered catastrophic side effects during the gene seed implantation process. Though the death of his closest friend since childhood was a source of great pain to Lorgar, he bore the loss stoically, as an event predestined to occur. Despite such views being regarded as laughable superstition on all but the most primitive imperial worlds, Lorgar was unashamed by his beliefs. He saw to it that the word-bearers and the Covenant embraced the worship of the Emperor with unrivaled devotion. They made it their duty to bring enlightenment to the galaxy. Lorgar and his Legion of Astartes were charged with reclaiming the scattered worlds settled by humanity under the rightful dominion of the Emperor, and they took to the task with zeal. Each world they liberated required a lengthy period in which they built great cathedrals to the Emperor and won the people over to the cause. They would not continue on to the next planet until the previous one's devotion was unquestioned. Although their progress was much slower than that of other legions, the planets converted by the word-bearers such as Yara and Fortrea Quintus stand among the most devout in the Imperium, unwavering in even the darkest days of the heresy. However, with 1,000,000 worlds to claim, the Emperor grew concerned. When the summons came to attend the Master of Mankind, the word-bearers took it as a pilgrimage, and the entire fleet set aside their plans of conquest to attend to their lord. Lorgar took his audience with the Emperor as a great honor and hung on every word his father said. He emerged transformed, his eyes open to how he might even better serve the great work. By making such slow progress, they were denying so many other worlds the Emperor's truth. In the words of Lorgar, let the reclamation of worlds in the Great Crusade be the way we praise him. By the time the word-bearers reached their next world, the expedition had transformed its practice beyond all recognition. The task of converting newly compliant worlds to the worship of the Emperor was instead given over to men and women from outside the Legion. These preachers and missionaries were given the task of guiding the worlds in worship after the word-bearers had gone, beyond the ad hoc army of zealots that gravitated to their banner. A new, highly trained and well-resourced military formation was created, called the Frateris Militaris. Nominally independent of the Imperial Army and Navy, they would ensure the preachers' voices were heard. These changes greatly accelerated their progress in the Great Crusade, but not content with spreading the word to their one small corner of the galaxy. Lorgar went further. He approached his brother Primarchs to incorporate chaplains into their own legions, and while many rebuffed the idea as outside interference, the Thousand Sons, Dark Angels, and Luna Wolves were the first to embrace the concept. Lorgar sent his personal confessor, Chaplain Erebus, to Horus's legion, and he became a frequent visitor and confidant to the man who would eventually become War Master. As Lorgar's tenets for the worship of the Emperor as divine spread through the Imperium, it incorporated other nascent cults dedicated to the Master of Mankind. One of the most influential sects they absorbed was that of Lectitio Divinitatus, a faith prevalent amongst the artists, poets, iterators, and even military forces that accompanied the Great Crusade's expeditions. The co-opting of this group strengthened a religion already in the ascendant, and brought with it a group of people adept at catching the imagination and stirring the passions. At Ulanor, the Emperor announced that he was going to return to Terra, and that Horus would command the Great Crusade as War Master in his stead. His last act before leaving was to call a conclave at Nicaea to rule upon the allegations of sorcery surrounding the Thousand Sons, and indeed that all psychers within the Legiones Astartes, the brother Primarchs, were sharply divided in their opinions, and not even Lorgar's robust defense of his friend could sway Russ and Mortarion from their stance. The Emperor eventually ruled that there would be tighter restrictions on Astartes' librarians, and in addition, the Thousand Sons would be soul-bound and merge their essence with him to grant them greater protection from the dangers of the warp. Lorgar saw this as a great honor for his friend, and when he spoke with Magnus, even referred to it as a communion with the divine. It was then that Magnus revealed the dark truth that had been haunting him, that the words of Corax, Russ, and Mortarion held more to fear than even they realized. On that night, Magnus explained to Lorgar the nature of the Imperium, the existence of the Chaos Gods, and the vulnerability of Psychers, too weak or weak-willed to resist. It was, he said, a truth so devastating that the Emperor would rather it not be known, even to most of his sons, for the fear it would bring. Magnus, however, believed that Lorgar must know, and that widespread belief in the Emperor would be vital to shield them from the sinister powers. The vigilance of the Word-bearers and the Thousand Sons paid off sooner than they could possibly have expected. On the primitive world of Davin, War Master Horus was laid low, and while the baffled apothecaries misdiagnosed the malady as the effects of poison, Chaplain Erebus recognized the signs of demonic possession. Together with the psychic presence of the Thousand Sons Primarch, Erebus carried out an exorcism which banished the entity and brought the War Master back from the brink. From that point onwards, the Sons of Horus joined the covert war against Chaos. The barely averted possession of the War Master had brought home to Lorgar the dire threats posed by the ruinous powers, and that not even the Primarchs were immune to the danger. The Imperium was not yet ready to accept the full horror of what they faced, but Lorgar, along with Horus and Magnus, remained alert to the machinations of Chaos. In a bitter twist of fate, this very caution was used by the Arch-Betrayer to further his own schemes, and is a salutary lesson into the wiles of the great enemy. For some time, there had been disquiet voiced over Roboute Guilliman's ever-expanding realm in the galactic east during the Great Crusade. His quest for power and control had driven him to claim vast areas of the galaxy, and his legion had swollen correspondingly. Even with the Eastern Fringe brought into compliance, Guilliman's domain had continued to grow as Imperial worlds, bordering it petitioned to join his so-called Ultramar segmentum. When Rogel Dorn approached Lorgar with evidence that the Ultramarines were set to secede from the Imperium and challenge the rightful rule of the Emperor, Lorgar was instantly concerned that the ruinous powers had found a new champion. Aware of Lorgar's suspicions, Dorn laid subtle hints to reinforce the impression that the Ultramarines had been corrupted. Claiming it was the will of the Emperor, Dorn had marshaled fully half of the Legiones Astartes to assault the Ultramar segmentum, while the bulk of the forces arrayed against Guilliman moved to strike at him on his newly conquered world of Istvan V. The Word-bearers and the Alpha Legion were tasked with attacking Ultramar segmentum from within. As was his favorite tactic, Alfarius scattered his legion far and wide to destabilize the rebellious segmentum, while Lorgar's fleet set course for the core worlds on the assumption that with Guilliman captured or dead, the rebels would look to Macrach for leadership. This plan was stymied because of the ever-increasing numbers of enemy vessels that shadowed them through the warp. This was seen as yet more evidence the Ultramarines were in league with the demonic, and only much later did it become clear that their course had been given away by Dorn, the arch-betrayer, forced to break out of the warp far short of Macrage. In an area of space known as the Abyss, the Word-Bearers tore into the shadowing Ultramar fleet with a ferocity born of righteous denied. Despite their triumph, it was clear from astropathic scans and readings of the Emperor's Terra that overwhelming forces had been massed for the defense of Macrage. Knowing the Word-Bearers' dogmatic approach, the Ultramarines had expected that nothing would deflect Lorgar from a frontal attack, and so had drawn their armies and fleets back to the expected, well-defended battleground of their capital world. Although not possessing the tactical genius of Horus or Alfarius, Lorgar's decision to split the fleet and attack the neighboring systems to draw the Ultramarines away from Macrage caught the defenders off guard, displaying a degree of brutal inventiveness not previously associated with the Word-Bearers. The lightly defended Ultramar worlds were devastated. Ajax and Talasar were invaded, and their cities sacked. Masali was bombarded from orbit, and Kelf Star was put to death by the battle barge Corfaro. Even that paled compared to Quintar, which they turned into World of the Blind without having to fire a single shot. The campaign proved successful in drawing the Ultramarines away from Macrage, and in the early stages, it seemed that it was only a matter of time before the planet would be weak enough to attack directly. All too soon, though, reinforcements started to flow into the area, and not just from neighboring subsectors, but Ultramarine forces fresh from their shocking victory at Istvan. Communication so far back to the Imperium through hostile territory was problematic, but eventually it became clear that Istvan had been a ruse. Rogel Dorn had been in league with Guilliman, and the Praetorian had plunged the Imperium into a civil war. Many of Lorgar's captains pleaded with him that they should return to Terra with all haste, but they were overruled. Lorgar said that no force could stand against the Emperor, and that as a god, he would inevitably destroy the traitors. Their duty remained the same. They must destroy Dorn's ally and prevent them from marching on Terra. Historians have debated Lorgar's motives for not returning to Terra. Most attribute it to his stubborn dogmatism and faith in the divinity of the Emperor, although a few cite practical considerations that they were so far away and so deeply mired in combat that they would never have been able to return in time to make a difference. Lorgar had already shown greater tactical skill than he was generally given credit for, and this has been viewed as further evidence of a growing tactical maturity. As the war went on, Guilliman himself returned to coordinate the defenses, and the scouring of the core worlds degenerated into a bloody stalemate. Although the Legion was gratified that the threats they posed at the heart of their realm prevented the Ultramarines from moving to reinforce Dorn's insurrection, the prospect of the Word-Bearers ever setting foot on Macrage seemed to diminish with each passing day. That was until the arrival of envoys from the Alpha Legion. Working together at last, a plan was devised to break the impasse with Alfarius' tactical genius and the Word-Bearer's stubborn determination and indomitable will. Macrage was to be brought to its knees. Using Alfarius himself as bait, the Alpha Legion drew Guilliman and a large proportion of his forces to the planet of Escrador. The Ultramarines could not pass up this rare chance to strike back at the Alpha Legion in open battle, and took advantage of the seemingly collapsing Word-Bearer threat to strike with overwhelming force. The grand assault upon Macrage never came, though just as the Word-Bearers were withdrawing from their scattered battlefields to assemble for a mass planetary assault, their plans were torn apart by catastrophic news. The Emperor had been grievously wounded by Dorn and lay dying. Lorgar couldn't have stopped his legion leaving for Terra even if he had wanted to, and they threw caution to the wind in their flight. In their grief, the Alpha Legion was forgotten. Withdrawal turned to rout, and many brothers died during the return to their ships. Many more lost their lives as their vessels were destroyed by the pursuing Ultramar fleet. A feeling of desolation settled over the Legion on the endless journey back to Terra. Despite Lorgar's calming presence, the thought their God Emperor could be proved vulnerable and therefore fallible gnawed at them. For some wounded brothers, it was too much. Brethren in the ship's apothecaria who should have returned rapidly to their squads died in droves. Even proud veterans who had passed unscathed through the bloodiest battles of Kaf and Ajax succumbed to the soul sickness, laying down their heads to rest, but never awaking. In the depths of the gloom, Lorgar addressed them. Every brother on every ship heard his proclamation. The Emperor was not dead, he said. His heart still beat and his soul still blazed like a nova within the Astronomicon. Had he not destroyed the arch-betrayer and banished the traitor legions from his sight? He explained that this was an act of transcendence, preordained, and that just like the fate of his friend Corpharon, it was not their place to question or doubt the divine actions of the Emperor. The events they had endured were a test of faith. Some had been found wanting and been judged accordingly. Those that remained had proved themselves and were all the stronger for it. When Lorgar stepped down from the command pulpit, there was a silence so deep it drowned out the noise of the fleet's warp engines. Then as one, every brother raised a cry of devotion to the Emperor and to their Primarch. With that one speech, Lorgar healed the spiritual wounds that had threatened to cripple the word-bearers, and by the time they reached Terra, they stood ready to take their place as paragons of faith in the God Emperor of mankind. Dornian Heresy had revealed the true, horrifying nature of the ruinous palace, and despite, or even because of the Emperor's sacrifice, Imperial citizens turned to worship him in their trillions. Lorgar's talk of faith in the Master of Mankind being soul armor against chaos resonated with a fearful populace, and within decades it had become the official religion of the Imperium. The monumental task of coordinating the worship of the God Emperor across the galaxy was given to a new body called the Adeptus Ministorum, or the Ecclesiarchy. As you know, the Ecclesiarchy is very similar, well, if not almost the exact same, as the ecclesiarchy we have today. It was only natural that Lorgar, author of most of their tenets of faith and son of the divine emperor, should lead this anew body. As ecclesiarch, he became one of the high lords of Terra, the group that ruled in the emperor's stead. So, here, the ecclesiarchy has a much bigger say on the doings of the High Lords. Cathedrals, basilicas, and monasteries dedicated to the faith sprang up across the Imperium, especially on planets where the Emperor himself had walked during the Great Crusade. No true Imperial citizen was without a devotional medallion bearing the thunderbolt and lightning sigil, and shrines in workplaces and homes became commonplace. Preachers and missionaries accompanied the fleets that brought worlds back into the Imperial fold, with even the most backward feudal lord taught a suitably simplified version of the creed. Lorgar used his growing influence to heal the rift between Terra and the Adepts of Mars. There was much bitterness at the Mechanicus' relative silence during the heresy, but after much discussion, an understanding was reached whereby the Tech Priests and Magos were publicly reaffirmed the Omnissiah as an aspect of the Emperor's divinity. He also bartered the Word-Bearer's support for Abaddon's crusades in return for his own words of faith. In the main, these were directed against the traitor legions that most closely aligned themselves with the gods of chaos, but on occasion it became necessary to fight against human worlds that had perverted the Imperial creed for their own ends. Although Lorgar was the ecclesiarch, he was also a primarch of the Adeptus Astartes and continued to lead his legion into battle. In M36, warp storms swept across the whole of the Imperium, disrupting travel and weakening the boundaries between the physical plane and the realm of the ruinous powers. This led to widespread unrest as planets were periodically isolated and the whispers of chaos grew stronger. It was the start of what later came to be called the Age of Apostasy. Now, this is fairly similar to the Age of Apostasy that you know, but this is where the similarities end. To combat this, Lorgar personally voyaged across the Imperium, reigniting the faith of those who had faltered and rooting out the chaos cults that sprang up in unprecedented numbers. On the planet of Demonare, Lorgar led a force of word-bearers and Frater Militaris against an outbreak of the Plague of Unbelief. The scale of the infection ran far deeper than had been anticipated, though most of the population had degenerated into hollow-eyed Walking Dead and demons of Nurgle stalked the streets. Despite Lorgar's inspiring presence, his small force was cut off and surrounded by enemies numbering in the billions. When their final bolt round had been expended and the last flask of sanctified promethium had run dry, Lorgar threw open the great doors of the cathedral. They had garrisoned in the shadow of his father's house of worship. He and his battle brothers strode out unafraid into the press of plague-infected wretches. In a strong, steady voice, Lorgar recited from the scriptures of the dead, his sacred warhammer in one hand, a meter-long adamantium spike of the cathedral's damaged altar in the other. For days the slaughter went on, and Lorgar wearied not of battle, but of the waste of his emperor's humanity. Though he could have fought on until the end of time, Lorgar dropped to his knees in prayer to his father, as his retinue formed a protective circle around their primarch. The battlefield was enveloped by a golden glow and a feeling of peace which gave even the pestilent hordes pause. When it faded away, the Primarch of the Word-Bearer's soul had returned to the Emperor. Despite the many wounds he had suffered, his face was peaceful and at rest. This final sacrifice infused the world with the Emperor's grace, and in doing so, every demon was banished and the plague of unbelief driven from every human on the planet. It is said that there is no zealot like a convert, and the survivors of Ultramar set out to demonstrate the truth of this. As living proof of the power of the Emperor to save their bodies and souls from the fell powers, they returned to the worship of Holy Terra with a passion. Ultramar rapidly became a shrine world, and such was their piety that the word-bearers even took to recruiting from the planet. For the word-bearers, the loss of Lorgar was a tragedy second only to the Emperor's grievous wounding at the climax of the Dornian Heresy. Without their Primarch, the word-bearers were bereft, going through the motions as before, but pale shadows of their former selves, into the yawning abyss. Left by Lorgar, stepped an ambitious and greedy marine, by the name of Goge Vandyre. In this galaxy, Goge Vandyre was a mere mortal. But in that galaxy that I had visited, he was a legionnaire of the 17th Legion that excelled in organization rather than in piety, and his guiding principle proved to be the actual of personal power. Such a person should never have been allowed to become a word-bearer, just like how Goge Vandyre should never have been allowed to step in power. But once inside, his manipulative, scheming nature saw him rise inexorably through the ranks. While the Legion grieved, Vandyre smoothly assumed command of the word-bearers, and so doing became the Imperium's new ecclesiarch. Vandyre's Imperium was in a perilously fragile state, though still racked by work storms and beset by the resurgent traitor legions. His response was to call for ever more brutal wars of faith, rather than targeting the true enemy. These pogroms were aimed at persecuting parts of the Imperium that showed even minor doctrinal differences to his own increasingly idiosyncratic view, or wars which balked at the ever higher tithes demanded by the Ministorum. While Vandyre's radical interpretation of the lore differed wildly from Lorgar's, the concept of disobeying orders came harder to the word-bearers than perhaps any other legion. A sense of deep unease spread through the legion, and they took increasingly creative interpretations of Vandyre's edicts to minimize the harm that they were doing, much to their master's displeasure. Events came to a head when Vandyre moved to oppose the only group able to threaten his schemes, the Legione Astartes. Up until that point, the other legions had stayed neutral in the power struggle. The wars of faith were carefully targeted to avoid systems with marine homeworlds or recruiting bases, and both sides were unwilling to be the first to fire for fear of igniting a second interlegionary war. This uneasy arrangement was broken when Vandyre accused the Emperor's children, who had never felt the need to have chaplains in their ranks, of impiety. When the Legion Master of the World Eater spoke in their defense, he and their chaplaincy were branded apostates for defying the will of the ecclesiarch. With the threat of whole legions being branded as excommunicate traitores, it seemed inevitable that brother would once again be pitted against brother, to the ruin of all. You know that in this timeline, Goge Vandyre was slain by a mortal by the name of Sebastian Thor. But in the timeline of the Dornian Heresy, he was a word-bearer's legionnaire that was born on Demonare, which the symbolism was definitely noticed by his followers. Thor claimed with great passion and eloquence that the actions Vandyre had taken spat upon everything that their Primarch had stood for, and called for him to immediately step down. In response, Thor was branded a heretic and sentenced in his absence to death. Any forces sent to carry out the ecclesiarchal retreat, be they Frateris Militaris, Imperial Army, or detachments of word-bearers, only swelled Thor's host as they were won over by his stirring oratory. Recognizing a sense of purpose they had thought lost, The word-bearers flocked to Thor's banner. Even Marines from other loyalist legions joined the great pilgrimage through the Imperium, which led inexorably towards Holy Terra and the confrontation with the insane ecclesiarchy. Feeling his control of the Imperium slipping away, Vandyr revealed the existence of a previously hidden and fanatically loyal force. He had long been concerned over the way his own legion had responded to his edicts, and knowing the Frateris Militaris were no match for Astartes, Vandyr had, though base trickery, groomed a sect called the Brides of the Emperor to become his enforcers. Their faith was subtly corrupted into an unshakable devotion to Vandyr himself, and using his position, armed them with potent weaponry, and even a crude version of power armor. Thor's open defiance pushed Vandyr to send contingents of his brides to ensure the compliance of the word-bearers, but this insult backfired. The resulting bloodshed pushed ever more grand companies to side with Thor. By the time the coalition reached Holy Terra, Vandyr's paranoia and desperation had reached fever pitch. The seriousness of the situation had even penetrated the secluded, armored throne room of the Emperor himself, and tragedy struck when a group of custodians were attacked and killed by the Brides, who claimed that they had tried to sway them from their loyalty to Vandyr. After that outrage, what became known as the Second Siege of Terra was bloody and brief, unwilling to back down even in the face of the Emperor's displeasure. The Brides died to a woman, and their order expunged from the pages of history. Disheveled and raging, Vandyr was hauled bodily from his hiding place by Sebastian Thor. His time of misrule at an end. The two word-bearers were then brought by the custodians to the Emperor's throne room to face judgment, while Thor emerged as the new ecclesiarch. Goge Vandyr was never seen again, and none present would ever speak of his fate. In the timeline of the Dornian Heresy, as you can see, the Sisters of Battle had been corrupted and then expunged from history. For that, the Adepta Sororitas never existed there. It is a testament to the character of Sebastian Thor that he was able to rebuild the reputation of both the ecclesiarchy and the word-bearers. Part of the act of contrition was to make radical changes to the organizations of both bodies, while the High Lords of Terra were purged of Vandyr's influence. Thor took advantage of the waning warp storms to tour the Imperium and reorganize the Ministorum. Even though Vandyr was gone, his cronies were unwilling to yield the petty fiefdoms without a fight. The traitor legions had also taken advantage of the confusion to venture forth from the Eye of Terror. By the time the word-bearers reached the domain of the apostate Cardinal Bucharis, they found that the entire subsector's population had been called by the butchers of Leman Russ's space wolves. At long last, the greed, corruption and lust for power that had been so rife under Vandyr's rule were swept away, with the Ministorum returned to its role of guiding the galaxy in the worship of the Divine Emperor, and to protecting the Imperium from the whispers of the fell powers. Sebastian Thor announced his final reform. He stepped down as the ecclesiarch. No longer would any word-bearer hold the robe. Instead, the Legion became the chamber militant of the Ministorum, acting not only as its strong right arm, but as the body charged with ensuring it never again overstepped its bounds. These decisions returned stability to the galaxy, and marked an end to the Age of Apostasy. And ever since, the word-bearers have remained diligent guardians of the Emperor's truth in the Imperium. As you can see, they have taken the roles of the Adepta Sororitas, the The word bearers frequently took to the field of battle, leading much larger groups such as the Frateris Militaris, Imperial Army, or even massed mobs of pilgrims. It also places much weight upon divinations and interpretations of the Emperor's tarot, and for these reasons the word bearers have gained a reputation for tactical inflexibility and naivety. While it is true that they cannot match the skill at arms of the World Eaters or the strategic acumen of the Alpha Legion, it is a foolish commander who underestimates them. Once dedicated to a goal, the word bearers are enthused with an unquenchable will to succeed, and the exhortations of their chaplains drive them to incredible feats of strength and the endurance that can only end in victory or martyrdom. They inspire the same fervor in those around them, so that once committed, the only way for the battle to end is with the total annihilation of one side or the other. While the word bearers are at the fatal spear point in any attack, the psychological effects of endless tide of wild-eyed zealots closing on the enemy cannot be discounted. These mobs are often little more than local citizens, untrained and armed with nothing but improvised weapons. Individually, they are no match for a well-drilled opponent, and yet they give their lives willingly in the service of the Emperor, and are lauded for doing so. Just like your typical Imperial citizen, that is. Across the Imperium, there are vast monuments built to honor the glorious sacrifice of these martyrs, often alongside the mass graves of the fallen, or idiots. Martyrdom is stupidity. For nearly 5 millennia, the word bearers were commanded by Lorgar, and in their Primarch's absence, this role has fallen to the Legion Master, aware that the first person to hold the position came perilously close to destroying the Legion. Subsequent masters have been diligent in their attempts to redeem it. Despite the moral authority that chaplains wield amongst the word bearers, they do not command. Such a task is far too important to get bogged down in the minutiae of directing the flow of battle. Instead, their role is to provide spiritual guidance, inspire their brethren, and watch over the souls of those under their charge. Librarians are greatly valued by the captains of grand companies, and their divinations and predicative abilities, through readings of the Emperor's Terra, are used to inform strategy. It is also common for companies to be drastically reorganized on the eve of battle, based on how the cards fall, even if it flies in the face of what is known of the enemy or expected battlefield conditions. Despite disdain for this practice from outside the Legion, it has proved to be divinely inspired on countless occasions, while I personally believe it is superstition. Inspired on countless occasions, even when it has led to catastrophic defeats, these are born with stoicism as the will of the Emperor. Personally, I believe this is utter stupidity. Because of the dramatic changes in organization from battle to battle, squads are not assigned to assault, tactical, or devastator specialties. Instead, Marines are expected to be proficient each of the roles. Their designation on the battlefield is displayed by colored votive cloths draped from shoulder pauldrons, with sergeants proudly displaying their colors on richly embroidered back banners. Help to identify the squad's position to their officers. It also acts as a spur to inspire their allies to ever greater acts of valor. Their role as guardian of the Imperial Creed, enforcing and where necessary, checking the power of the Ministorum, requires the Legion's strength be distributed thinly across the galaxy. For this reason, word-bearer grand companies are composed of less than 500 brethren each, perhaps half the size of that found in most other legions, the better to cover the vast distances involved. Their fleets are accompanied by ramshackle civilian transports, packed with zealots eager to martyr themselves for the cause, as well as regiments of frateris militaris encased in matte black carapace armor and wielding powerful hellguns and purging flame weaponry. The grim-faced frateris endlessly strive to emulate their Astartes superiors. Belief in the Emperor as divine is the guiding light of the word-bearers. Something I thought was never possible, but in the Dornian Heresy it is. But I digress. They understand better than most of the threat from the ruinous powers, and that mankind is beset on all sides by malign forces that would seek to destroy or enslave it. Only through a deep understanding and acceptance of the Emperor's light can the Imperium hope to survive. And to that end, they help to spread his holy word to the furthest corners of the galaxy. Like how here they spread the word of chaos through the galaxy. Though it is routine to carve the words of Lorgar into the ceramite of their power armor, some initiates choose to sear large passages of holy texts into their flesh, so that they will never be without the words of their Primarch. This practice is often taken to the extremes by chaplains, with a rare few covering their entire bodies, heads and even their tongues with the sacred script. This is done with a red-hot stylus and the sap of black julabush, a plant native to Colchis. Because of the superhuman regenerative capabilities of the Astartes constitution, even this potent scarring will fade over time. And just as faith must constantly be renewed, so too must the devotional script branded into their skin. The homeworld of the word-bearers, Colchis, is something that is pretty much similar to Ophelia. Long isolated from the wider human galaxy, was reborn with the arrival of Lorgar. His presence brought back not only a new era of piety, but drew the attention of the God Emperor himself to their world. In the thousands of years since, it was embraced by the Imperium. Colchis has become a focal point for the Adeptus Ministorum. The holy places and temples of the Covenant have been expanded, and now there are a multitude of cathedrals, basilicas, and shrines to the saints, and through them, the Master of mankind. Pilgrims flock to Colchis in their millions. But the holiest site, the place where the Emperor first set foot on the world, is forbidden, because on that spot was built the Legion's fortress monastery. From there, protected by adamantium walls as strong as their faith, the word-bearers ensure that their compact with the Imperium is kept. Engraved upon those walls, just as it is engraved upon their souls, is the credo that Lorgar adopted on returning back to Colchis after seeing the Emperor entombed within the Astronomicon. The Emperor protects, but we must also protect the Emperor. Like their faith, the gene seed of the word-bearers is pure, with all implants working as efficiently as when Lorgar commanded the Legion. Their apothecaries treat the gene seed as sacred, a palpable connection to their beloved Primarch, and regard it with the same reverence the chaplains hold the word of Lorgar. The word-bearers draw their recruits not just from Colchis, but from across the Emperor's realm. Strength of faith is as important a factor as skill at arms, and such cardinal worlds and the Ministorum run Schola Progenium orphanages are prime recruiting grounds. Word-bearers are expected to be thoroughly conversant with Lorgar's writings, which teach the importance of sacrifice and willingness to suffer pain and death in the face of unrighteous. Such lessons are excellent preparation for the life of an Astartes. Just as the gene seed implantation procedure strengthens the body, their lessons in theology strengthen their souls. Despite the skill of the Legion's apothecaries, there are cases where the Primarch's gene flash finds the neophyte wanting, just as happened with Lorgar's friend Corfaron. This is stoically accepted as the will of the Emperor. Most of those who are rejected are granted the Emperor's mercy, but some are spared and find another way to serve, doing menial tasks for the Ministorum. Because of this, it is not uncommon to see these pitifully misshapen, hunched figures in the shadows of cathedrals, acting as crawler page-turners during masses of ringing the bells to call the faithful to worship. And as for their battle cry, the word-bearers do not have a single fixed battle cry. Instead, an appropriate passage is chosen by the chaplain from amongst the books of Lorgar. He then leads the assembled Marines in a recitation of the faith, before blessing them for the coming battle. Just as they are zealous of the ruinous powers here, in the Dornian Heresy, they are zealous to the faith of the Emperor.